It kind of all became clear.
Welcome to the Locofoco Netcast, which we begin in this first episode with math. This will not be a math podcast, I can assure you. But it will be a critical common sense podcast.
But you see it as a possibility. If he wants to spend $1 billion beating this guy, he could do it.
What was interesting about the math error on MSNBC last week was not the arithmetic error. It was in part the lack of common sense on the part of everyone involved, including most commentators.
Absolutely.
Let's have a go.
Somebody tweeted recently that actually with the money he spent, he could have given every American $1 million.
I've got it. Let's put it up on the screen. When I read it tonight on social media, it kind of all became clear. Bloomberg spent $500 million on ads. U.S. population, 327 million. Don't tell us if you're ahead of us on the math. He could have given each American $1 million and have had lunch money left over. It's an incredible way of putting it.
It's an incredible way.
It really is.
Of putting it. It's true. It's disturbing. It does suggest, what we're talking about here, which is there's too much money in politics.
I'm laughing with Stefan Molyneux, whose commentary I especially enjoyed.
How on earth does this get on air?
Because he got to the heart of why a math error of astounding proportions got on air to the smug and self-confident commentary of its purveyors, but how it passed through producers and interns and technical men and gaffers, for all I know, whatever a gaffer is. Molyneux's discussion of this is great, and I direct you to his talk on the subject. But what I didn't care for so much was Stefan Molyneux's discussion of the math. And he's not alone, and I'm going to single him out only because I think this is actually kind of an important thing, and I think he might appreciate it as well.
The actual math, of course, $500 million on the ads, U.S. population 327 million. 327 million is less than 500 million. So it's not $1 million and change per person. It's $1.53 per person. So that's off by close to a factor of 1,000, right?
The thing is, when people saw that initial tweet, in fact, when the person, this Miss Rivas, wrote it, she got hung up on, I think, not wanting to do the arithmetic. I mean, she saw some big numbers, and she thought, oh, we can give everybody $1 million. But the not wanting to do the arithmetic is what interests me here. And I didn't want to do it either. But I knew there was something wrong with it without doing the division, right?
$1.53.
Even before I thought, does 327 go into 500 million or does 500 million go to 327 million? I mean, before I went to even the most basic concept, I looked at it the other direction. I took a step back and looked at it the other way. Let's say you want to give $1 million away to every person in the United States. Well, how many people can you give $1 million away to if you have only limited funds? And even Bloomberg has limited funds. And he had $500 million that he spent on his campaign. So he was going to give out, if he was to give out $1 million out of his $500 million fund, how many people could get it? 500. Right? It's 500 million. This is common sense arithmetic. This doesn't require any division. It's just what the number is. And if you know that you want to give $1 million out to people out of a fund, and the fund is 500 million, you know you can give it to 500 people. It's 500 million. This is common sense. This is really, really basic. What is your intuition about this tweet? Your intuition should have been, that's nonsense. The fact that it wasn't people's intuition about that is kind of disturbing. And to me, it's not the resistance to doing arithmetic. I mean, we are an amazingly dumb society. And I'm really not all that much different. But I do know what 500 million means. It means 500 millions. Okay, so I wanted to get that off my chest because this is an element of common sense and critical common sense that I think is important to understanding the world we live in. And about a month ago, a friend of mine and I discussed at some length a piece by Tyler Cowen. Tyler Cowen is an economist, and I'm sure quite numerate. I've read his writings, but I don't remember a lot of math in them. But this is, let's not get too hung up on the math. Okay, it's not a math podcast, but we are going to be talking logic and common sense and definitions. Really, that's all I did with the 500 million, right? Was a definition of what 500 million was. So, Tyler Cowen wrote a piece at the beginning of the year that caused a stir in the libertarian movement, somewhat, in which he argued for a new kind of libertarianism. And I wasn't impressed. Were you? Well, here's the conversation between me and James Gill. So you and I have been doing Loco Foco for several years now in a sort of haphazard way on YouTube. Now I'm going to see if we can do it for a podcast. And this all comes to mind, and it's a kind of interesting in relationship to something that just was published this month anyway, earlier this month by Tyler Cowen, an economist at George Mason University. He wrote a piece called "What Libertarianism Has Become and Will Become: State Capacity Libertarianism." I find it to be a bizarre piece of argument.
Well, first of all, has he just sort of reinvented menarchism?
No, because he's basically arguing for an extensive transfer state.
So he's still arguing for the transfer business.
Yeah, that's in there,
So
but also big projects too. He loves big projects. He wants.
So, in what sense is any of this libertarian?
Almost no sense. And that's the thing that griped me when what I wrote about on Workman.com. That's Workman with an I, folks, not an O. Anyway, on Workman.com, I wrote a piece on that, and I found his arguments kind of bizarre, but basically the whole idea bizarre. If at some point you reject the main parts of an ideology, but you still want to call yourself that, why do you want to call yourself that? What are you aiming to get out of it? For instance, a libertarian could call themselves a free market Marxist if they believed in, let's say, 5 things that Karl Marx believed. But why would you do that? What are you trying to gain out of it? I think it's kind of deceptive. And I don't know, I don't want to call Tyler Cowen a liar, but I think that he is in some sense not being honest with himself and others. It's not libertarianism to want to have a huge state in investing in huge infrastructure projects. That's not libertarianism. That's something else.
How about the traditional libertarian statist view is that you need a certain level of statism to guarantee freedom and individualism, and that's Cowen's argument, more or less. Right?
Yeah, except that you wouldn't call it statism. Statism is something more than having a state. Having a strong state of a state, that's not statism. Statism is defined pretty clearly by Mises, and that is a special kind of where the state's involved in everything.
Yeah, well, doesn't every redistribution scheme require state involvement in every aspect of your life?
Well, it starts happening.
How do you do it if you're not running everybody's life and calculating who deserves what? And I mean,
yeah. There's something worse though too. Once the government intervenes in something and tries to micromanage it, it goes awry, and then they blame the non-government part, the free market. So they make more government.
I noticed Cowen wants to disavow the people who go through that pattern. That is, he sort of anticipates some of these arguments. And again, I see his position as wanting to use the state to guarantee freedom. I mean, it's the sacrifice, making the sacrifice now to get the thing we want later. That seems to be the argument that he's advancing, that the state, yes, is an encroachment on freedom, but it's in the long run a guarantor of freedom.
Yeah, except that he doesn't mention the word freedom in the whole piece. He's talking about libertarianism, but he doesn't use the word freedom.
How do you talk about libertarianism without mentioning freedom?
He doesn't use the word liberty either. So here's a guy who says he's a libertarian of some sort, and he doesn't use the word freedom and liberty. He just used the word libertarianism to discuss many of the things he wants in government. He
wants to be an active government person who gets to call himself a libertarian.
Yes, that's what he wants.
His justification seems to be, this is the way we guarantee libertarian values, is by taking this larger government course. Although, again, he disavows the giant state. Although I don't see how you we come back to the problem of how do you maintain the minimal state? The state, once it started, snowballs, and there doesn't seem to be any way
Yeah,
around.
and he doesn't have any demarcators. Since he doesn't talk about freedom, and he certainly disavows the idea of prohibiting the initiation of force, because governments are based on the initiation of force. And in fact, it's not as if libertarians and classical liberals have not been for the state most of the time. They just want a very small one, right? And then they put on principles. This is how we limit it, and they have these principles to limit it. The thing is that Tyler Cowen doesn't talk about those limitations very much either. It's a very odd piece.
He wants to disavow the anti-statist libertarians, the anarchists. He wants to get them out of his camp. Would you say that's a fair thing?
Well, that's true, but he's arguing against Ron Paul, and Ron Paul was not an anarchist. Is not an anarchist.
That's just the Beltway. What would you call that split?
Well, it's the cosmotarian.
It's the Beltway guys who want to call everybody, all the libertarians they don't like, racist, right?
Yes, that's a very important thing for them.
Their agenda seems to be Cowan's agenda. He's more of a large government system with a little hat tip to liberty. It's not entirely clear to me how this is different from most conservatives at this point.
Yeah, it's just a kind of conservatism. It's a Hamiltonianism. It's a form of Hamiltonianism is basically what it is, and as such, it's on the other side. You know, it was Hamilton versus Jefferson was basically the big split in the early United States, and I read what Tyler's written, and it doesn't look at all like libertarianism. Now, I know he likes libertarian theory. He's actually written about the anarcho-capitalist idea at a very interesting critical comment in a journal that I enjoyed a lot over the years. In fact, he basically duplicated one of my arguments from the old days that I always challenged my anarchist friends with. But still the point is that he wants government in space. He wants government to do all sorts of infrastructure things. What are the things? He thinks he wants to keep China at bay. A strong state, as he says, a strong state is very distinct from a large or tyrannical state. A good, strong state should see the maintenance and extension of capitalism as one of its primary duties. Okay, what principle does he go to? Libertarians are talking about rights. I bet he doesn't use the word rights at all either. That would be gauche for him to do, right? So let's look and see if he has the word rights. Nope, he doesn't talk about that either.
He wants the status quo, but with a strong bias towards libertarianism. That is, am I off base there? That he kind of likes just, the state of government as we have it. He just wishes it was a little more liberty oriented.
Yeah, that's what he wants, as far as I can tell. And we should remember, what does that do for him? That's the question. When somebody wants to keep a term that he's not a libertarian. I mean, this is not what libertarianism means. Liberty it's about equal liberty. It's about equal freedom. It comes back to that idea. So if you don't like that idea, if you just like freedom in general, though you don't want to use the term, what are you trying to accomplish? Well, what do all economists want to do? They want to advise the state. Economists, their main job is to advise state policy. So he just wants to be an economist, apparently, or encourage the kind of economists, or train the kind of economists whose job it would be to manage a state with a little bit more market-oriented. But, I have another objection to his whole thing. He's instead of talking about freedom and liberty, or even civil rights, and there's a whole bunch of things he doesn't talk about here. Instead of all that, he brings up, markets. We should have more markets. One of the old complaints that almost everybody had against economists was that they only talked about markets and money. They were so obsessed with just markets and money, and it was called economism. And I mean, leftists just love this talk.
Was it applied to free market guys in particular, or just economists in particular?
Well, free market guys in particular, but all economists in general. And the interesting thing is that freedom isn't just about markets, because freedom allows for all sorts of things. Like, your family isn't a market, right? Your community group doesn't need to be a market. Markets are the nexus of trades. And not everything that we do voluntarily in cooperation is a trade. And I know this is heretical in some libertarian circles, because they do buy what I consider Catalactic imperialism, the idea of seeing everything in terms of trade, which I don't think is correct. I think it's a silly idea. And so my objection here to Tyler Cowen is that he seems to be falling for that, because he keeps on talking about markets as what's libertarian in his system. That's what's libertarian. He doesn't talk about your personal rights. He doesn't talk about your private property very much.
If he talks about any of that, then his larger government agenda is scuttled.
I don't mind a person saying that I'm not a libertarian anymore, because then we can argue. What do you and do you not support? What about liberty don't you like? One of my best friends says that he's for freedom but not liberty. Well, that's an interesting conversation. I don't have any interesting conversations really after I read Tyler Cowen's piece. I just sort of roll my eyes, because what he seems to be doing is he's trying to package new wine in old wineskin.
It is kind of a badge of honor lately. There was a long period of time, the late 90s, early 2000s, where liberty and freedom became almost epithets. That is, people seemed to, it was not uncommon to see people poo-poo the idea of freedom. Well, I know I've gotten in debates with lots of people who immediately will dismiss any foundation that has liberty or freedom in the name, because they assume it's a far-right propaganda site. So freedom, liberty started to become associated with far-right propagandism.
But for leftists, it's also what they don't like about libertarianism.
Yeah, well, they mistake it. They don't understand the differences between conservatism and libertarianism.
Well, sure.
Most people don't. But at some point, and I think it's been the rise of the internet and the rise of the libertarian debaters who have gotten people at least straightened out people a little bit on the meaning of freedom. I have the sense that those terms, those concepts, they've changed in public discourse in the last 10 years or so, and everybody wants the freedom badge. Everybody now wants to be able to say, "Oh yeah, I'm concerned about libertarianism," but the message of what exactly freedom means is very muddled still at this point.
Well, Lakoff, the linguist, who's a Democrat and a progressive, he's written several books about, conservatives have their kind of freedom. We have our kind of freedom. Mm. They believe in the negative freedom, right? And we progressives believe in positive freedoms. And that is where the whole thing comes down to. I look at the idea of positive liberty as a confusion, and it's something that we can't have equally, but negative freedom is something we can all have equally. Everyone can be free in the sense that we talk about. Not everyone can be free in the sense that progressives talk about it. And they won't fess up to that.
Yeah, the word freedom has many different levels of meaning, many different layers of meaning. And the way libertarians use freedom is the way I explain it to people. I'm using freedom in the same way that it was used by the founders and by the abolitionists. And even those were two different sorts of freedom, but they had to do with limiting control through force, limiting the initiation of control through force. That's what the abolitionists were talking about it, and the founders made it not being controlled by another nation. That is, we're going to run our own country. But I think we know that many of the sort of Enlightenment founders, and many of them they were part of that movement, understood the meaning of liberty as well. The founders were using it in both ways, liberty and freedom. And I think the abolitionists then applied it to the individual.
Right.
Both of those are examples of the application of negative freedoms, not positive freedoms, and that's what I'm arguing for. The same principles we argued for in the founding and during slavery. And if you want to argue for positive freedoms, for things like you should have free health care and free education and free how do they frame it? Bernie says you're not really free if you're not free of worry about your health care bills or about where you're going to live. You're not truly free. Well, that's a different use of the word freedom.
Well, it's a different context.
Yeah,
right.
Because the slaves I mean, the slaves got free health care, they got free housing, they got all of these things, but we wouldn't call them free. And the same is true of prisoners. Prisoners get all of these things. They get all these positive freedoms, these so-called. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what libertarians are talking about.
It's good to mention prisoners and slaves, because that's exactly, you just explained a really good paradigm to jolt the mind of somebody who think positive freedom is where it's at, because they don't have negative freedom. They are very much confined, but they have the things.
Those are legitimate issues to be concerned about. I mean, it is true. If you don't have money, it's really hard to do certain things. So ideally, you're going to put yourself in a position. So those kind of freedoms are important, but those aren't the kind of freedoms libertarians are talking about. We're not talking, at least I'm not talking about the freedom to run around naked on a stage. I mean, that's all fine and good. I like the power to do things. How would you define positive freedom? It's the wherewithal to be able to do something. That is, I'm not controlled by circumstances. I can overcome the control that circumstances may want to impose on me. We're not talking about the control that circumstances want to. That is the necessity to earn your bread. Sure, that is an aspect of reality trying to control you. And as freedom-oriented people, we don't want to be controlled. But in a political realm, that doesn't, worrying about that is not what we're talking about. Is that all fair to say?
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, I think it's important to talk about all this, Timothy, because there's still a lot of confusion about what freedom means.
We'll have a special episode on the various meanings of freedom and liberty in the future. It's absolutely necessary, because people are so confused.
Yeah, well, they're all important, but some of them are addressable in a political realm, and some of them are not. And once you try to address some of these in the political realm, you destroy the thing you're trying to achieve.
And so, meanwhile, that distinction, though, between negative and positive freedom is important, because libertarians are very positive about negative freedom, and progressives are very negative about negative freedom. So I first accepted being called a libertarian in 1980. So that's a long time already. That's 40 years ago. And through much of that time, I didn't always call myself a libertarian, and I wouldn't defend the term, because some libertarians don't like what I say. For one thing, everything is provisional for me. All beliefs about society and politics and morality are provisional for me. We make bets. I mean, believing is not always an easy thing, right? I don't believe in certitude. And certainly advocating a completely free society where all of law and government is geared toward the right to freedom, to be free from initiated coercion, initiated force. To do that, we are so far from that. We don't know if it can work. Can human beings actually manage that? I think a good third of the population could easily manage that. But I think right now, a good third of the population would probably die. They're so geared to the society we live in now. If you think that I'm not a libertarian because I don't necessarily agree that morality leads to anarcho-capitalism, which most of my friends believe, is that there is no case for a state. The state is an illegitimate form of government. And I agree with them to this extent, is that a universalistic moral argument for the state is not coherent. It doesn't make sense. And once you give that up, you are already a philosophical anarchist. That's the technical term for a person who doesn't believe that there is a universalistic moral case for the state. And I don't believe there is one. I believe there is a prudential case for the state, which means that we're willing to accept a lot of crime in society. And the crime is in at least two places. One is amongst criminals whom we fight, and then amongst the people whom we have granted huge powers to fight the criminals. And the problem is that second group is awfully bigger than the first group. And they want to suck us all into their maw and make us spend more of our time and money and wealth and attention into their endeavors to do whatever it is they're trying to do. And I don't know how far we can get to the point where we reduce the state down to liberty, or destroy the state into a panarchy of competing and cooperating protection agencies. I don't know how far that can go. I'm completely agnostic on the subject. And if libertarianism is to you that you must believe that there should be a minimal state or no state, according to the idea of the right to freedom. If that's what you believe libertarianism is, and I'm very willing to grant that, then I might not be a libertarian. And certainly there needs to be a term for the belief that the right to liberty is the sole function of government. And I would like that to be the case, because I don't think there's a good moral case against it. But human beings being what they are, and not because they're too bad and they need to be controlled, it's because in controlling it, they become too bad. I don't know. There's a very strange dialectic at work, and human beings may be too much like baboons.
Well, in one sense, the market does supply a framework for those people who need to follow, who need to be led, and those who want to lead. There's a strain in libertarianism that hates work. Remember Bob Black, who wanted to abolish work because he saw it as a form of slavery. And there are libertarians who do see work as a form of slavery. On the other hand, it is an environment in which people who need to function as followers and leaders can profitably thrive. So that may be a feature and not a bug of capitalism, is that it has a command and control mechanism for those who want it, for those who need it, and for those who need to go off and be entrepreneurs, be their own boss, be free in that way. That's also available.
Sure, and we have religions and we have community groups as well. And every group that we're involved in, there's a hierarchy. And libertarianism isn't against hierarchies. In fact, everywhere I've ever been,
we're just against violence hierarchies, right? We're interested in information hierarchies, ideally.
Yeah, and division of labor. There are many things I don't want to lead on. In fact, I don't want to lead on most things. Frankly, I don't want to lead. I don't want to lead this group or that group. Somebody else can do it.
Most libertarians, I think, aren't intellectual libertarians. Don't seem to be very interested in being leaders. At least I find it abhorrent, the whole idea of people wanting to kowtow to me. I think that's just a libertarian frame of mind. But there are a lot of people who are different. They want to be the boss. They want to be and there are a lot of people who want to follow, who want to be told what to do, who want a situation in which there are rules that they can follow. There's an organization within which they can fit and they can contribute. For many of us, that's a step, but it's a hard step. Like Bob Black and that corner of libertarianism that sees employment as slavery. And that sort of ties into the left libertarians and the progressive libertarians who say flat out,
Yeah. Well, I don't consider them libertarians at all, and I don't consider Bob Black a libertarian. So I don't even consider him a little bit. Not even a little bit.
But you can see his impulse there is for a kind of freedom. He doesn't want to be controlled.
Yeah, sure. But that's the same thing with wanting to be free from having to pay your bills.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we'd all like to not have to pay our bills, and sometimes desperately so.
But wanting to be controlled is a sort of fundamental libertarian impulse, right? You don't want some outside. You want to be in control. You want sovereignty. Sovereignty is the basic libertarian impulse. Is that fair?
Well, maybe. It's certainly that's every libertarian wants to be sovereign, and that's what we're always talking about, sovereign in some sense, right?
But there are a lot of people who don't want sovereignty. As I said, there are people who want to be told what to do, and I think the market can provide that framework.
Well, sure, but I even want to be told what to do many things. When I go to a family reunion, I don't want to organize the stupid thing. I want my sisters to take control and tell me where to put the potato salad. And this is...
I think a lot of men that do this in their relationships. They go ahead and say, okay, you can be in control. We'll do what you want to do. You seem like it's really important to you to run everything. Go ahead and do it.
Well, that's entirely legitimate. Why would I want to be in charge of that? And that's the origin of many hierarchies right there, is that most people don't want to lead. You only want to lead a few things, right? You only want to lead where you're good at. Why would I want to lead, well, for instance, an orchestra? I might want to, but I'm not going to take up the job because I'm not good enough to lead an orchestra. Well, I'm more than willing to let a great conductor lead an orchestra because it's better for me. It's one of the reasons we have a state in the first place. Is just this very idea, is the division of hierarchy, the division of labor within hierarchies. Is most people know that they're not going to want to be in charge of defending the community. So the strongest men get to be. The problem with putting the strongest men in charge of defending the community is that the bigger the community gets, then they begin to become a little bit tyrannical. They take advantage, and it gets to be that problem. The bigger the community, the harder it is to organize it on a free basis and a contractual basis. And so the chieftain becomes more oppressive than the tribe, and the early states were sometimes vastly oppressive, simply because the strong men took control. And generally, why a normal person doesn't want to be in charge of defending the community and organizing the labor of fighters to defend the community. But then when those people get so good that they can tyrannize them, well, you just let them do it. And that's the origin of the state, is that you just let those guys do it. Well, libertarianism is a way of gaining some control back from us. And we have a simple idea on this. This is libertarians. It comes right down to one thing: contract. The social contract theory has brought this up as a justification for the state, is that people would naturally choose to contractually support the people who defend them. That would just be a natural thing to do. But people don't do it because there's no explicit contracts here. It's all just accommodations over and over again, with lots of ritual and ideology and religion tossed in. And that's a history of states. Libertarians offer, we can actually have more explicit contracts. Not merely a constitution, which isn't a contract at all, as Lysander Spooner so correctly put it, but also with actual explicit contracts. That's the libertarian idea right down to the thing, is that, yeah, I'll accept your authority to, grab criminals and that kind of stuff, but I'm going to pay you $50 a month on this condition, but not those conditions. And if I don't like what you do, I'm going to stop giving $50 a month to you. I like the idea of talking about libertarianism as the idea of the right to liberty enshrined in law, or as it's the pivot point which everything revolves around, and not having it be other forms of state power or other agendas or even public goods as such. Now, libertarianism is a good term for that doctrine. And when you understand the idea of negative freedom universalized, that's libertarianism is a good idea. And to the extent you reject it is the extent which I think in fair play, you shouldn't call yourself a libertarian. You're not a libertarian to the extent that you reject that idea. So I really was disappointed in Tyler Cowen's piece, because to me, it didn't seem like a reasonable approach to what he's up to.
Well, a lot of the people who argue against libertarianism argue against it because it seems so radical. That is, Scott Adams was making fun of libertarianism the other day. And basically he said he agrees with the part of libertarianism that they aren't crazy or something like that, which means that he's not libertarian because it all seems crazy to him. That is, when you find yourself doing certain things that are just so obviously crazy, like, not regulating businesses because they're so, how else do we keep them from poisoning us and hurting us and killing us?
Yeah.
The mainstream culture sees that as ridiculous. And it may be that people like Tyler Cowen are trying to give libertarianism a place within the current sort of establishment. That is, trying to make it seem less scary, less radical, by showing how it would fit into our current framework. But that's what conservatives do, right?
It's also what I've done. I mean, that's one of the things I do, is that you try to reach people where they're at and explain where, regulation doesn't do what you think it does, right? Regulations usually have the opposite effect of what you think it does. The things that you think, the reasons we have regulations aren't even the reasons we have regulations. People think that the reason there's regulations on food is because meat people and meat packers were poisoning people with bad food. And that's why we have the federal, the Food and Drug Administration. That's not why we have it at all. That's not why it occurred. That may be why a bunch of people thought it was a good idea, but it was promoted by industry to consolidate and cartelize the industry. It made it easier for them to keep out competition. And there really wasn't, many of the problems identified weren't even real problems. When the big businesses demand regulations in their industry, it's usually because they're trying to find a way to keep competitors out. The classic example of this is banking. After the 1907 debacle, in the economy wherein the Morgan Bank bailed out lots of other banks. They decided, well, we have to get the government involved in this. We have to, because I don't want to do this again, is basically what Morgan says. I don't want to do this. He wanted to socialize the costs of him bailing out the banks. And so the Federal Reserve was born. It wasn't born out of the fact that a whole bunch of people who really wanted a Federal Reserve or a central bank. That was not a huge thing. In fact, it turns out that most of the time, most people aren't clamoring for regulation. It's usually just a few people, and oddly, they tend to be in the industries they're talking about, and interestingly, those people often have something to gain. So it's
whenever I bring up libertarianism with civilians, their automatic reaction is, well, without regulation, if the government's not, making sure that everything's safe for us, then we'll just be living in chaos and destruction, and be victimized by the rich.
No one gets rich by killing off their customers. Okay, that's a very, very low. That's a very, very niche market.
But you don't think that most corporations would do whatever they can get away with to make a quick profit?
Well, yes and no.
And a lot of them would. Just think about all the people you've met. There are a bunch of people.
Yeah, and what happens at that point when they do something that's so bad that it hurts somebody? Well, for one thing, if it's putting poisonous products out, there is a tort claim here, right? And breach of contract claims. There are a number of legal mechanisms with normal common law that would work. But it's also, if right tomorrow, to get a very high profit, you poison your customers, it gets out, what happens to your product? It goes into the toilet. People turn out to actually go out of business when they kill off their clients.
This didn't happen in the case of pollution. That is, the companies just made things worse and worse and got more and more polluted, and they weren't being prosecuted, and the legal system.
Yeah, but that's not the same thing. That's not something we're not talking about regulating products here. We're talking about regulating non-products, right? That's regulating non-products that's put into the commons. So that's another thing entirely, and it has to be distinguished, because it's one thing to poison me when I buy a good from you. It's another thing to poison me when you're when you're upstream in the wind, putting out poison in the air. And that's a case where other kinds of law apply. And that kind of regulation, there are things that are non-regulatory. There are ways of handling it through property rights. And it turns out in 19th century America, most of the common law redress for externalities problems like that were abridged in the name of increasing capitalism, that is, increasing business. So they basically gave special privileges to people to do things that would not have been allowed under common law because they were invading property rights. And then that got more and more got out of hand, because of course if you give people an out, and still take a mile, so we're not going to prosecute you for polluting, so you can just do as much as you want, then of course there would be lots of pollution. Now, it's also worth noting that before the pollution was going down in North America through local regulations as well as other mechanisms before the federal government took over. So there's various levels of government as well that could be applied here. But that's another question. The question is,
to deny, though, that all of those regulations in the 70s sure did seem to clean up smog.
Yeah, sure. That was done to correct a problem that was caused by government having eroded the common law already, where politicians had legislated loopholes for businesses to pollute to allow for more business. And why would they do that? Well, businesses were donors to their campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
So there we are. There's another thing, is that government causes a problem and then government is the solution. And this is where libertarians are probably at their most frustrated most of the time, is that we have a great difficulty getting people to go to the original causes of problems instead of coming up with these regulatory fixes or these tax fixes or program fixes. They don't want to solve a problem, in part because that problem was a solution to a previous problem. And that solution led to a constituency for that program or special privilege or whatever. And every time there's a constituency for something, people, politicians especially, don't like the bucket, because a constituency is a lobbying group and gives money to politicians. And it gives to an illusion in politics. This is the great illusion in politics, is that what is in the public interest? Well, it turns out is that we have constituencies of groups who benefit from this or that or that or this, and they have more interest in specific programs than the general glut of citizens do, right? Most of us don't have much incentive to fight a bad solution to a problem. It's easier for us to let somebody else take care of it because it's just cost effective. But all those bad solutions to problems that we've sloughed off because we wouldn't stick to principle because it was too costly lead to more and more regulations that add on to regulations that cause problems that need more regulations. And then you lead to the basic problem of statism, where you don't really know who the beneficiaries really on net are, because there's so many struggling and competing special solutions to problems. There's transfer programs to this person, transfer programs to that person, special tax loopholes, special taxes. I mean, you have all these programs, and after a while, no one can really tell who's getting the advantage here. And that's great for government and great for people who work in government. It's not great for the citizens, and it's not even plausible that's good for citizens. And this is our case. The problem is, to see this case requires more brain power than most people are willing to turn on to solve a problem. Why? Because brain power is expensive, and people don't, it's that problem of public goods. So what I'm basically arguing is that most people argue against libertarianism in terms of public goods. Because we need to solve a public goods problem, these public bads that happen. And the argument for liberty is precisely that kind of argument. And the best case for liberty is the kind of argument that is arrayed against us. However, we're looking at it from one or two steps back, seeing a bigger picture. But that bigger picture is hard for most people to grasp because most people don't have the time to even devote 2 extra synapses to it. But back to Tyler.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, one of his early points. Let's see. It doesn't seem to me that old-style libertarianism can solve or even very well address a number of major problems. Most significantly, climate change. Actually, I heard David Friedman make a similar point. He once said, "It may be that climate change simply can't be solved by libertarianism." And I always wished I would have gotten him to explain that. I felt like I understood him at the moment he said it, but now I'm not entirely sure where he was going with it. Because what you're saying is, if you're saying libertarianism can't solve the climate change problem, what you're saying is people have to be forced to behave in a certain way in order to solve the climate change problem. Am I mistaken?
Yeah, except that I think that it's the wrong way to look at the problem entirely. First is, they think we know what the climate change problem is. We do not. This is just pseudoscience. We don't know exactly what the problem is, if there is one. We don't even know if there is one, by the way. Most scientists, this whole 97% of scientists agree that climate change is caused by human beings, and it's going to be a horror show. Well, that's not what most scientists believe. That's just not true. You can look this up. I think a libertarian order, a free society, is the best way to handle climate change. And I wrote so in my discussion of Tyler Cowen. He says, he laments that it doesn't seem that old-style libertarianism can solve or even very well address a number of major problems, most significantly climate change. My counter is, a free society would easier address climate change by allowing people to adapt better. How so? They would not take it as a government mandate that every crop must be saved in every spot, every beachfront saved as it now stands, and all people must stay put unless subsidized to move. The assumption of government is that government must be the mover. But people move very well when they have incentivized, but we use government to actually enforce stasis. The proper response to climate change is adaptation. There is climate change always going on, and we're always going to have to adapt to it. And a free society will always be better at adaptation than a status society, because status societies are encumbered with interest groups that demand stasis. This is the absolute wrong response to climate change. Now, let's get away from that, because that's not what they're talking about. They don't care about adapting to climate change. They don't care about how people deal with climate change. Really, they want to stop climate change. And to me, this is so absurd. It's so silly because it assumes the thing to be proved and the thing has not been proved. They keep on trotting out very bad science to prove that there's catastrophic global warming right around the corner. Every day, every week, we get new lies about this is the hottest week on record, the hottest year on record, blah, blah, blah. I mean, a friend of ours from near Hong Kong just read an article that last year was the hottest on record. And he said, no one in there believes that because it was a very cool year and a very wet year. This year, it looks like it's going to be warmer. What will they say about that?
They kind of tipped their hand with the whole Green New Deal thing. Their agenda became pretty clear.
Yeah.
And
their agenda was always clear. But, about 10 years ago, I actually believed this stuff because I couldn't believe that scientists would be this deceptive. The people who called themselves scientists would be this. I was wrong. I started looking into it deeper. Let's just say the two big names in catastrophism, James Hansen and Michael Mann, two scientists, one associated with NASA for a long time and maybe NOAA, and the other associated with the IPCC reports. Well, we caught them. I mean, we caught them in a whole bunch of weird contradictions. And then there is that problem of they keep on predicting the end of the world in 10 years or 12 years. And we get to that 10 or 12 year mark and they let it go another 10 or 12 years. They just reset the downward clock.
One reason they're so giddy about it is they believe it proves that capitalism is a failure because they see the current state of energy consumption and energy exploration as a natural development of capitalism. And the only way to get it under control now is to get capitalism under control.
Right. You're entirely correct. That is what they're doing. The problem is that the level of poverty has just been going down and down and down, and no one in their right mind attributes it to government action. Which puts them in a weird position, right? It puts them in the position of being against the thing that's doing us the most good. Against the thing that's doing us the most good and bringing people out of poverty worldwide. That's a real strange position to be in, but we're getting a little far afield. So why don't you read that weird passage in Tyler about his own background and the internet as an educator?
Smart people on the internet, and the internet seems to encourage synthetic and eclectic views, at least among the smart and curious. Unlike the mass culture of the 70s, it does not tend to breed capital L libertarianism.
I dealt with this in my piece that I wrote about on workman.com. I wrote, the 1970s didn't breed a large movement of capital L libertarians. It merely bred a vibrant tribe of extremely inquisitive and culturally daring individualists. But we were a small batch. We weren't a huge batch. Capital L libertarianism was not ascendant. That's absurd. We were a small batch of people. The net is producing today far more of us than we produced in the late 70s. It's also producing a lot more of other things. Phew. End part one. That moment when you realize this is going to go on for over an hour. So in the previous section of our talk, we were discussing Tyler Cowen, and we'd gotten through 3 of his points. And there's at least 2 more that I think we should deal with. He says, he's talking about state capacity, and there's failures of state capacity is what he's worried about in our time. And he says, our governments cannot address climate change. We've talked about that. It can't much improve K-12 education, he says. It can't fix traffic congestion or improve the quality of their discretionary spending. Much of our physical infrastructure is stagnant or declining in quality. The state is all through those institutions. The state is doing those things.
Yeah.
It's very odd. Libertarians generally say, we don't want the government in those areas because they mess it up, especially in America, which is such a big place. And I mean, there's reasons for the more competing interest groups that get involved in a public good, the messier it gets and the more corruption's involved. This is just how it works. There's a great book on this subject, and which I will talk about in a subsequent podcast. And the idea basically is that diversity doesn't work very well when you have a maximum state. There's a diversity of interests, a diversity of values, all these things compete and they degrade the quality of the services. That's why monoculture societies can handle bigger governments. We look to Sweden and Denmark and Finland and Norway, and those were until recently all monocultures. And now that they've invited in people from Africa and the Near East, they're degrading quickly. And they've had problems with too much government anyway. It was way over.
Saying there's something wrong with Africans and Asians?
No, I'm saying there's something wrong with when you are providing lots and lots of public goods. If you have a diversity of tribes, so to speak, a diversity of ethnic groups, a diversity of cultures, trying to get the advantage, they don't feel, they all want to suck as much out. It becomes a tragedy of the commons. And that's why a monoculture allows for other means of controlling some of the negative aspects of big government. Big government is really a problem. It's very odd to see Tyler Cowen not addressing the fact that libertarians have answers for K-12 education. It's get the government out of it.
Well, certainly he knows this. He's not. I mean, he knows all about libertarianism.
Yeah. But I guess I really need to. I guess I should, if I wanted to give him his due, read the links that he provided about.
I read
the theory.
some of them. I read.
Did you?
Yeah.
Is there anything interesting? That
one of the links takes you to this page on Cato that's having a big debate, and people like Brian Doherty and Tyler Cowen and all sorts of people are talking. Of course, when people start debating online, that's a lot of text that's generated. So have some, but they're all smart guys, worth reading, certainly.
They're not all in Tyler's camp, I presume.
Oh no, Lord, no. They're all over the place.
And are they making the same points?
These are libertarians. Every one of them disagree.
Yeah, but also they're probably object to the fact that his libertarianism isn't libertarian, right? I assume that's one of their major complaints.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I just find that whole state capacity. We have a problem of failures of state capacity. Well, I don't think it's a failure of state capacity so much as a failure of too much state, and that's a standard libertarian critique, and I don't see any reason to change that critique. He says that the major problem areas of our time have been Africa and South Asia. They are both lacking in markets and also in state capacity. You know, one of the things all those places are missing as well? They're all missing an ethos of people who are willing to mind their own business but not become predators and parasites. They all have problems, they have a problem cooperating to compete, right? And they have a problem competing to a degree to cooperate in certain ways. What they don't have is anything like a liberal ethos in most of those places.
So what you're saying is black people and Asians can't control themselves or govern themselves.
Well, I'm not saying they can't. I'm saying they don't do it very well. I think that there's some reason to believe that. But much of it's also the fact that many of these countries have had colonial and Western machinations and states placed upon them that are not integral to their cultures at all. I mean, we're still trying to get Iraq to work, which has three major ethnic groups, right? Three wildly divergent groups of people: Sunnis, who used to be in power; Shia, and now they're a problem because we don't like Iran. I mean, and then there's the Kurds. And so you have these three major groups, and they were put together. And why are we fighting to keep them together? What's the reason? Because Britain decided that they need to be a country. This whole thing of carrying on Britain's it just doesn't make any sense. It never made sense. And I predicted as soon as we went, the whole thing about the conquest of Iraq, I said it's back in 2003 or whatever year it was that leading up to it, I was blogging heavily on this, and I basically predicted disaster because they were trying to keep Iraq one, and it just doesn't make any sense. Once again, you have a diversity of values, and they're trying to impose one state that has lots and lots of projects, public goods. That's the part of the theory. It's part of classical liberal analysis of what goes wrong with big states, which is why we prefer smaller states if you want diversity. That's what libertarians offer. You want diversity? Yeah, we all love diversity. It's great. But diversity means that you have to concentrate on fewer public goods provided mandatory way, right? So you offer liberty and not offer security. You offer rule of law and not regulatory agencies up the wazoo. So once again, I don't see any of this as proving Tyler's point. So I'm underwhelmed by this piece. And
well,
of course,
a lot of the stuff I hear from the Beltway libertarians sounds like what seem to be misguided attempts to court the left. And maybe, I mean, they're there. Maybe they see something we don't see. I mean, it's very likely. These guys aren't dummies. And they're trying to make a set of connections that make sense to them. we're not all going to be doing the same thing. I mean, as you said before, liberty's fought on many fronts. The fight for liberty is fought on many fronts. And it may well be that the Beltway guys know exactly what they're doing. They're making connections with the establishment, because let's face it, the establishment's not going to just disappear. All of these power holders are still there. They're still locked into these vast matrices of connections and influence and power. And it seems like maybe the Beltway guys see that they've got to make some common ground with some of these people. And
Maybe.
that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah, but of course it has nothing to do with, at some point you cease being libertarian in doing it. All I'm saying is that it's not as interesting to me anymore, because you were not offering anything really new here. They're trying to find common ground, and the common ground they're finding is the maximum state, which is not an interesting common ground for me. It's
No,
just
that's
like,
not very.
it's
unless Tyler's trying to pull the old Dayton's.
Yeah.
Here's your state. Whoops.
I don't think they're trying to do that at all. And it is worth remembering that many of these people, like Tyler Cowen, are paid for by tax money. That's where they get their money from. They're either they get it either through the student loan system or tuitions that are heavily subsidized, the Pell Grants and all that stuff, or they just get it out of taxes. That's where their salaries come from. They are part of the state apparatus. So the more you're in the state apparatus, the more likely you are to say, hey, no, this state isn't that bad. It's one of the reasons statism perpetuates.
I mean, I'm part of it. How bad could it be?
Yeah. My potato salad metaphor or example was just simply the idea that we have to remember that it's really not about control, and it's not about feeling free. We have to distinguish between the mechanisms of control and its force and the threat of force. That is, it's coercion, it's compulsion that libertarians are worried about. And everything else, there's plenty of scope, like for me, to follow my sister's or any other woman's advice at a picnic, put the salad where they tell me to. And I have no desire to take control of those things. And that's just fine. Like you said, the market provides. That is, it's an arena where we all get what we want, and we do different things, including sometimes we're in control and sometimes we're not. Arguably, one of the big social problems of our time, I think, is that because religion is no longer very strong, 100 years ago, the banker often went to the same church as the street sweeper or the stable manager. They went to, and there were people of many different stations, and they were worshiping in one church, and they had some respect for each other and their separate stations in life. And the banker was not necessarily a bigger man than the deacon of the church, who might have been somebody who didn't do much more than work on metal and hot irons and fire. That's maybe.
Have you ever seen that great Martin Luther King speech? I think he's talking to a crowd of high schoolers, and he's telling them that if they get a job as a street sweeper,
yeah,
be the best street sweeper that ever walked the earth. And when Martin Luther King tells you that, you go, yes, sir, I will.
Well, that's a very Christian argument. It's very explicit. I don't remember if it's in Paul or Jesus himself in the Gospels, where basically the commandment to an employee is that you do double duty, that you're the most diligent person, and you're trying to earn your part. You're not trying to be, you must not be a slacker to your contractor, the person who's hired you. And that's the argument that's made. And it's actually a very stirring message. I don't think one hears that popularly anymore. And that's.
Is it in pop culture?
I don't see it in pop culture. Where is it in pop culture? To be the sluggard and the rebellious, the frowardness is much more common.
Yeah,
their individuality is expressed by being basically an asshat at work. The first real socialist I ever met was at a job I was probably 18 years old, and he talked about how the owner was lining his pockets with the work of him. He was pulling orders from shelves, and he had no conception of it.
Think of all the money and wealth he would have had if that guy had never opened his business.
Yeah,
the thief who was taking all that money from him.
Yeah, he actually said the man was lining his pockets with the labor that he was providing.
How do they get people to say these things? How do you get people to say things like that and not hear how ridiculous they sound?
Well, I think it really helps to be a college graduate, or at least have been to college. It really
Well, they're the ones who are worse about it, right? The
well, they're
college
the ones.
graduates.
Yeah, but
But
they're
at least the liberal arts graduates are the ones that,
yeah.
American university system produces the best scientists and engineers and everything else in the world. But Jesus Christ, is their liberal arts program falling
Yeah.
short?
And especially English departments are very, very bad. But even economics is not as good as it used to be. There's a lot of nonsense going on. Anyway, so here we are complaining about the young. I think that means that we're officially old now. But I'm still willing to carry the potato salad where somebody tells me when I haven't made the potato salad.
One of the response I got to that meme, somebody jumped in.
What meme?
The one about the Heinlein meme about.
Yes.
Let's see, how does it go? The human race divides into those who want people to be controlled and those who have no such desire.
Right.
And the response I got, I think, well, anyway, I got it off of one of the libertarian Facebook groups, but it's a legitimate point. He said, well, everybody wants to control. Everybody in a company, people want to control. I think this gets back to your potato Saladarianism, though.
Yeah.
But his point is that's not a real division because everybody wants to control. I think if you read it with intelligence,
yeah, right.
It's implied by the sentence, but
right.
a little fleshing out is probably in order.
Well, and it's also control becomes a term of art.
Exactly.
It doesn't.
It's like
it is
freedom. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But the thing is that people get confused by terms of art that are slightly different meanings from normal usage.
I think people particularly have gotten confused around the concept of freedom, which is defined by a lack of something. And I think that sort of conceptual trap confuses people. That is, freedom.
I don't see a
freedom
trap.
Freedom is a lack of something, and
well,
so they get. And the trap is they have trouble wrapping their brain around the lack of something. Do you see what I'm saying? They think there should be something here. There should be something, but freedom.
But there is. But freedom allows for opportunities, opportunities for cooperation, and it's interesting to think about people talking about markets. Is that, and this is a big deal. I mean, Tyler Cowen mentions that markets is the only thing that he mentioned as libertarian in his piece, which really bugged me. But it's true that markets are misunderstood often because people see it as only as competition. And that is how some people push up markets is that, it's great, it's competition. Whoa. But every transaction is a work of cooperation. And what happens in markets,
presumably both gain in every trade.
Yes, that's the great Condillac truth that Destutt de Tracy, Thomas Jefferson's favorite economist, bequeathed to the world of the third school of political economy. The importance in a market and the importance of freedom is the ability to walk away from something. And that actually adds the competitive edge that allows people to actually find the best terms for cooperation. They don't get the idea that cooperation thrives when non-cooperation was a possibility. And many people see, we need to do this, so people must do this. We need to have security, therefore people must be forced to have security, right?
I think a reason that libertarians have trouble connecting with most leftists is because, well, I know a lot of the libertarians who came in via my path through Rand got that strict egoism, virtue of selfishness business that make them want to go on the attack whenever somebody starts talking about group effort or cooperative enterprises. But the thing is, cooperative enterprises aren't anti-libertarian. They're the whole point. Cooperation, voluntary cooperation is what we're trying for. We know large groups of people are like magic. It's magic, the idea of people cooperating, but you can't force people to do it. Every little element of that group has to be free. And that's when the magic of the group happens.
Right.
And all of these people have gotten the idea that, look at all the things humanity can do when we work together. That's absolutely right. It's a miracle. The possibilities that emerge when people come together are awe-inspiring. But you can't bring violence into it. Because when you bring violence into it, what you create is a world of violence. You create a society of violence.
Just scuttles finding the best way to do something. Because once you force somebody to do something, you forced also a pattern. You forced a way of doing it. But when people can say no, there's a great concept from, what's his name, Hirschman, an economist who was arguing that when you're dealing with questions of loyalty, there's two different processes. There's voice and there's exit. These are the two major factors in the concept of loyalty. And many people in a modern, who think they're democratic, are very, very concerned about voice. You have your voice. You hear this on the left all the time. You have to express yourself. You have to be included at what you included to what, so that you can contribute your voice to something. Now, you almost never get your way, which somehow never crosses their mind.
Yeah. How did they get sold that bag of hooey as well? I remember it being taught to me in high school. The question, how democracy works. We have to accept the will of the majority, because you did have a vote. You did have a vote, and that was your agreement that you were going to accept the will of the majority. How does that work?
And what libertarians offer is that we offer exit as a means. That's actually exit. The ability to exit a solution leads to better solutions. That's where the competition comes in. If there's no exit, there's not really much competition, because we're trying to find our better ways to cooperate. And it is about cooperation, and that is actually the main theme of Herbert Spencer and Ludwig von Mises in social theory. They do not emphasize, either one of them emphasize and lead up front with competition, which was the classical economists' main course, is that the great virtue in competition, and they kept on putting it over and over again. And they were right. There is something amazing in competition, because it's basically about exit and allowing for new terms for new forms of cooperation. But if you force things, then there's no more exit, and you're left with voice, which is often a very feeble thing. Now, voice is actually important as well. I mean, we have to remember that's how we get any form of cooperation anyway, is through voice. We are rational creatures, and voice is important. But if there's no exit, there's no voice. Is just an expressive thing that on the left they talk about inclusion in the group. So people talk about voice because what they want is voice that encourages group solidarity, and they talk about this all the time. And that's why they're so upset about exclusion. Remember, exclusion is the big theme on the left these days. They want inclusion, and voice is very important to increase inclusion. The problem is, of course, is that people don't agree, and so when people have different voices, but you can only do one thing in a group that's dedicated to one thing, right? If you're in a state, you can only have a limited number of things you can do. So then what do you do with these competing voices, the voices that don't want to cooperate, that want to do something else, they want to pick up their marbles and go elsewhere? Well, the attitude of the left is increasingly, and has always been there, is just clamp down on the voices of dissent.
Either force them to do it or put them in jail.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's the problem. That's the problem.
Yes. Yeah. And it goes right down to the heart of the matter of exclusion and inclusion, and voice and exit. And libertarians are big on both, actually, but we want exit to. The ability to exit a cooperative enterprise is what's the test of the utility of that enterprise.
But the collectivist point is, there are some problems so enormous that they can't be addressed by the individual. They need a collective, presumably coerced collective action.
But once again, we're right there. The point of liberty is not to deny collective action. It's to put a check on collective action so it doesn't become tyrannical. And the left has forgotten that story. I mean, once upon a time, the left was very much against the ancient tyrannies, right?
Exactly.
So
early, yeah. Even the leftists of my youth would be appalled by these people.
Yeah. At some point we need to talk about...
You remember that interview, the Bill Buckley interview? Bill Buckley, Jack Kerouac, Ed Sanders of the Fugs, and the prominent journalist of the day. It's a great episode of Firing Line. These are men across the political spectrum. This is 1969, and they all despise communism. Every one of them. Ed Sanders of the Fugs, every one of them despises communism. That's when Americans knew what the hell they were talking about. So,
well, yeah, we've lost a lot of that, largely because, of course, we have the ascendancy of modern schooling. I mean, we have basically these are people who've gone through K-12, public school education, and then they've been put through a liberal arts education or something like that, or something that's been corrupted by the liberal arts departments. So and the culture and on the campuses, and these cultures they don't really understand sophisticated things like this idea that we're all talking about cooperation. It's just the question is, how do we organize cooperation? And they increasingly think that it has to be organized coercively, and that's not.
Well, it's easy to understand why young people are so vulnerable to that argument, because that's the life they've been leading for presumably the last 17 years. They've been under someone else's control. Everything they know about how the world works is someone directing them how to live. That's the only way. That's the only thing they've been taught. That's all.
Is that true? Is that true anymore, though? Is there any direction from adults anymore to young people? It doesn't seem like there's a great deal.
Well, what happens in high schools right now? I mean, people, the regimentation and the...
Yeah, but they're taught all these platitudes about, it's a heavily ideological enterprise.
I'm not saying they get good guidance. All I'm saying is they're under someone's control at all times.
Yeah, but we were too.
Well, yeah, some of us made it out.
Yeah.
Some of us made it out. It seems like sometimes our current issue is getting through to people who have been brainwashed by 24-hour a day propaganda campaign by the media and the political establishment. I love my progressive friends. You know that. My friends on the left, this world would be a horrible, horrible place without my friends on the left. They're the artists, they're the writers, they're the people that give the world color and flavor. But they don't have any business running the world. As much as I love them, they're dreamers. They're not thinkers. And I don't know. That's why you have to have a limited democracy. Yeah. You can't have majorities making decisions like this because you need people who can think through these issues. I'm not calling my friends stupid. I'm not saying, they're too stupid to run their lives. What I'm saying is we all have different strengths, and politics is not one of the strengths of the left. They've gone terribly, terribly off track.
They certainly do like state capacity.
Yeah.
They want to make the government do all the things that they can imagine it doing. It's interesting. I'm trying to think back. What was the moment when I realized that I didn't believe the leftist line at all? And to me, it was actually while reading News from Nowhere by William Morris, which was a description of a communist anarchist society, a medieval communist anarchist society. And I knew it, and obviously it was preposterous. There was no way that human nature could work through that, the system of, I'll produce what I want to, I'll put it in a common store, and I'll take what I want, and it's going to work. I know a lot of people, who call themselves left libertarians. That's basically what they're offering. And you're saying that you're not questioning your friend's intelligence, but to my mind, if you bought that idea, you're a moron. And maybe not a moron on your SATs.
I've seen too many smart people fall for these arguments. So I think other things are at play.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, none of us have full attention to deal with every problem. I mean, I'm a moron when it comes to.
Well, we've talked about this. We're all far. I make fun of the left sometimes because as collectivists, they have no trouble being part of a group mind. They have no trouble farming out their opinion on this or that. That is what they're aiming for. Let's take them at their word. They are not individualists. They believe in the group, and they take comfort from the group.
If you outsource many of your opinions to others, the experts, if you're outsourcing your opinions on subjects, and we all do, we have to outsource many of our ideas. We get our ideas from somewhere else, but there's a problem: is that it's very easy for
that's what I was going to say. Yeah, we all have to outsource ideas. We can't. You and I haven't made up any of these ideas. They were given to us by wise men and women who lived before us, and so we've farmed out our opinions about these things, but we've also applied our intelligence to them as well.
We also searched. We did searches that many people don't do. Most people find ideas nearby and pick them up or throw them down. They don't go for a deep search. I mean, I did a deep search. I mean, that was where pretty much I've spent way too much time, probably by normal standards. I've spent way too much time doing a search on all sorts of subjects and delving.
Boy, are we in the golden age of searches, though?
We are.
I remember years ago reading Orson Scott Card's. He wrote a Foundation story, and one of those, And as you know, Asimov's universe, the Foundation universe,
Okay.
a bunch of writers came together and wrote stories in that universe. And Cards, as I remember, was all about, I don't remember the details, but what I do remember, it was my first taste of what an internet search might be like. And I remember I was so freaking thrilled. And I remember thinking, God, I wish I could live in that future world. Wouldn't that would be a cooler world to be in. Things have happened so goddamn fast. Things have changed so fast. We're in that world we were dreaming of, man. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I guess it is, though I must say I didn't dream of this.
Well, I didn't see it the way it came out, but
Right.
so much of it.
But there is a problem with the attitude of outsourcing and of the hive mind, and that is that it's very easy for certain very confident and ruthless people to rig the system.
Take the hive mind over. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's pretty much obvious that the CIA and a number of other deep state groups did that to America.
Hey, they tell us we're experts in intelligence. We're experts in propaganda, in manipulating public opinion. They don't, they're not hiding that. This is their profession. These are very, very smart men and women who have entered profession in which this is what they're supposed to do all day, every day while they're at work. You don't think they've got some good stuff up their sleeves, some good tricks up their sleeves, that you're not paying attention.
Right, but the thing is that they're also telling you what they're doing, and they're boasting of it, and it's not at all what we would want. They basically believe they should rule us.
Yeah,
they basically just said, thank God for the deep state was what.
Yeah. Who was it? Who said that? Who was it?
A former CIA head. I forget what his name is.
How did he just not lose his job immediately?
He's not in the CIA anymore. He's part. I think he's part of the CNN. Commentariat, and CNN is basically just the CIA propaganda mill.
How have we gone so far off track that a man in the government talking about anti-democratic rule wouldn't have been driven out with jeers and contempt? What's happened? How did we?
But look, also what happened to the left is that, can you imagine 30 years ago the left screaming that the CIA and the FBI must be trusted? When we were young, the left was against the CIA and FBI because they saw them as oppressors. And now the CIA and FBI is filled with people who are leftists. That's what Comey is. That's what Brennan is. These people are all basically leftists. And because of that, because of their commonality.
Horowitz says they're all communist. David Horowitz, the conservative.
Yeah.
Of course, he's called everybody communist over the years.
Yeah.
But he makes a pretty compelling case.
No, he does make a pretty compelling case. Just as we have the most popular Democratic candidate right now appears to be Bernie Sanders, who's never repudiated his defenses, and sometimes insane defenses of communism. Thankfully, he's two other things besides being a communist. He's also a coward. And he's also, we should discuss this some other time. There's 3 C's of what he is: a communist, a coward, and we'll talk about the 3rd C some other time.
A man of his country?
No.
Or something like that, right?
Anyway, so we're living interesting times. I don't know what to make of Tyler Cowen's bizarre. Well, I do know what to make of Tyler Cowen's bizarre state capacity libertarianism. It's not libertarian, and it doesn't interest me very much because the libertarian critique still makes sense for all the things that he talks about as requiring state capacity. And we're sort of ending the first episode of Loco Foco Netcast. So we'll see how it goes.
Be seeing you.
You can find us on the web at locofoco.us and locofoco.net. Thank you.
It kind of all became clear.